I think the basic point is we need a world in which cooperation is the dominant mode, whether that's to fight a pandemic or to fight climate change or to promote development. We can't do this in a divided world. And yet the tensions between the US and China have been rising, I think dangerously so, and I believe unnecessarily so. So that puts me a bit at odds with a lot of people in the United States. I would say most of the political class at this point, which takes it more or less for granted that China's an enemy. At best, will have harsh competitive relations, could get worse. I view all of that as wrong-spirited, wrong-headed, bad analysis, contrary to my own eyes and ears over the past 40 years. I've been going to China since 1981, typically a couple of times a year at a minimum, often several times a year. I've been all over China for decades, visiting remote areas, visiting Western China, Xinjiang, visiting Tibet, visiting Yunnan, visiting the coastal regions. And I do not see China as the enemy. I do not see China as the hostile force out to undermine U.S. well-being, which is actually even taken as an article of faith in our formal foreign policy documents, that China is out to undermine the United States and undermine the world. I think that this is a absolutely dangerous perspective. And by the way, if you believe it, the solution is sit down and negotiate and talk to the other side and solve problems, but not this kind of name-calling, shouting through the press. Of course, it was even more insane when we had a president on Twitter, because we should not have politicians on Twitter. I'm not sure we should have Twitter at all, frankly, but we should not be doing foreign policy by tweets. We should be discussing, solving, brainstorming, presenting evidence, analyzing, but not just name-calling, unilateral sanctions, attacking Chinese companies, warning, as our officials do everywhere in the world, don't you dare buy from Huawei. This will cause great damage to your relations with the United States. We're making threats all over the world that aim to really stop China's continued economic and technological development. I think it's disgusting and stupid, frankly. Those are the two adjectives that I would use. They do not comport with our well-being, with our national needs, and certainly not with the world's needs. That's what I called out. There aren't too many voices in the United States, unfortunately, calling for balance. We have both political parties that are anti-China. The Biden administration, just about every time it opens its mouth about China, is negative. Trump was crazy, so that was erratic. But Biden is not positive, not even neutral, and not so far saying, let's sit down and negotiate. In fact, the formal position is we're not going to have a strategic dialogue with China because we can't trust them, and we don't come out well in such strategic discussions. That's always a mistake. President Kennedy said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. That is the right position. And the position is sit down and talk, because so much is a misunderstanding, so much is biased thinking, so much is lack of perspective, that unless we talk, we can't understand each other and we can't solve problems. The U.S. is the one that walked out of all the agreements, that doesn't abide by international agreements. We're the one that say, no, we're not going to be part of the International Criminal Court. We're the one that is not a party to Convention on Biological Diversity. We're not a signatory of the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There's so many parts of international law that we don't abide by because a lot of United States action really is in the kind of Trump mindset. He put it, vulgarly and crudely, but it is no one's going to tell us what to do. Not the UN, not anyone else, as if law is some kind of punishment. Well, if you think that you're almighty, then you say, I don't want to be constrained by international law. And that has been a U.S. view of the U.S. right wing for a long time. But I think China actually wants international law because they see that with international law, they wouldn't be held back. They would be responsible for their own development. I think that they are proud and believers that if they have an international rule of law, they're going to thrive. I think that's true too. It's a very talented nation, a great civilization, a great history, a lot of catching up to do because of the horrible period under European and Japanese imperial pressure and war. So China's catching up. Good. That's what I would like to see in the world. Countries overcoming a sorrowful past history that had a lot to do with the imperial dominance, which was the 19th and 20th century experience up until the mid-century of the 20th century after World War II. And that's not pernicious, that's not against U.S. interests, but it is pro-China interests. And my feeling is that's great. I want to see China develop. But American policymakers are, they're horrified. Oh, they'd be bigger than us. Well, yeah, they have 4 times the population. So, of course, China would be bigger than us. Oh, they would catch up in technology. Yeah, why not? Capable people investing heavily in research and development. The idea that that necessarily diminishes the United States is the kind of dangerous zero-sum thinking that will get us into a lot of trouble if we persist in that. And you're right, Rob, that the playbook is the Cold War, and there is a reading of the Cold War that, God, didn't we do great? We went toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union, and they ended up collapsing. That's not how I read the Cold War. I read the Cold War as strongly unnecessary, extraordinarily dangerous, almost brought the world to annihilation. Annihilation, I'm not using the term casually. And something that we should be trying to avoid desperately, not to go back to that kind of danger which existed in that time.
I'll cite my acquaintance and recently partner in making a video, Daniel Ellsberg, whose book, The Doomsday Machine, talks about not just the bilateral conflict, but the burning of the upper atmosphere and the nuclear winter that can destroy, basically turn us into an ice age and destroy the food sources all over the earth. And
no one has been more vivid, more correct, more perspicacious than Daniel Ellsberg about these risks. That's a phenomenal book, The Doomsday Machine, but it's based on a phenomenal history. He was assigned, as you know very well, as a RAND officer after being a brilliant student in the first days of game theory at Harvard.
That's right.
He was assigned to look at nuclear policy of the United States, and he came to the horrifying realization that we had a finger on not only on the button, but on the button that would destroy the whole world. And that
Yes.
our doctrine was just about any accident could trigger a full-scale nuclear attack that by U.S. intelligence estimates would take out 700 million people or so, because it was going to be an attack to destroy the Soviet Union and China. Even if China wasn't directly involved, why not? We should target them as well. And then, as usual with the idiocy of our intelligence agencies, they didn't understand any of the atmospheric dynamics and the physics that would have ended our lives too.
I think that, there's a funny kind of blind spot that I saw you take on that BBC program, which is a lot of people in the United States say China is an authoritarian country and they don't treat people right. And in some regions, there's pretty good evidence for that. And you said, yeah, but what about how the United States treats people like African Americans and runs its prison systems and all the kind of things? That we're not in a place where, what you might call, we're going to go save the world unless we change how we practice what we preach ourselves. And I thought you're standing up to that mind frame really created quite a luster, quite a momentum in that conversation on BBC.
I have a foreign policy doctrine I call Jesus' foreign policy, because in the gospel, of course, Jesus famously says, why do you point to the mote in the other's eye when you have the beam in your own eye? And
Yes.
what Jesus is doing in the Gospels is explaining basically how not to judge in the wrong way. And he is saying you better take care of your own base, your own ethics, in order to be able to be ethical with regard to others as well.
Yes.
And
yes.
we have, of course, a terrible blind spot. Here, the United States has walked out of the Paris Climate Agreement under Trump, walked out of the World Health Organization under Trump, walked out of UNESCO, cut aid, behaved atrociously, imposed unilateral sanctions. That's all abroad, not to mention all of the civil rights and human rights violations at home. And the first thing we do when the Biden administration comes in is point the finger at them, even in the shadow of the insurrection that we had on January 6th.
Yes.
Well, that's not how to behave. How we should behave anyway with the new administration is to meet and say, let's hope for good cooperation, and that we can come to mutually beneficial understandings. That's how you greet someone anyway as a civilized human being. But in Alaska, we did just the opposite. We opened first words. What about Xinjiang? What about Hong Kong? What about Taiwan? Fighting words, the very first moment of interchange, as if the United States didn't have a lot of explaining to do about having a weird psychopathic president over the preceding 4 years, and can we pick up the pieces to get something normal going again? So
Yes.
this is my basic point, which is, we need to behave in a civilized way so that we can have a civilized relationship with other countries. And in a nuclear-armed world, it's insane to do otherwise.
I've seen you in the halls of the Vatican. I've seen the things you're exploring on what you might call framing the relationship between economic theory and the deeper moral teachings.
I do think, as you know, what Pope Francis is telling us is extremely pertinent for us. He's written two wonderful encyclicals, one called Laudato Si, which is about climate change and about environmental destruction. And he says, do not destroy creation. We depend on it. We are a part of of this world, and nature doesn't forgive. It will kick back very hard. And then he wrote a second encyclical called Fratelli Tutti, Brotherhood of All, or Brotherhood and Sisterhood of All, properly translated. And it's really a perfect accompaniment to the Sustainable Development encyclical, because it's about encounter with others. So it's framed around the Good Samaritan who helps the person in the road. And
Yes.
it's basically wisdom, pastoral wisdom of how to get along in this world. And I think that that is part of ancient truths. Of course, the ancient world also had its nonstop wars and genocide, so it's not as if they knew necessarily better, but the teachings of how to get along we can remember as being extraordinarily important. And Pope Francis is basically saying right now, we need a world that recognizes its interdependence. We need, actually, he says, we need a plan for our common home. And he's absolutely right about that.